With the legalization of adult recreational cannabis last year, Ridgefield's Planning and Zoning Commission passed a one-year moratorium and passed that hot potato back to the Board of Selectmen, who returned the favor by approving a policy prohibiting cannabis establishments in Ridgefield and sending it back to Planning and Zoning to pass the enabling regulation. After 3 public information sessions, the Ridgefield Board of Selectmen finally vote on a cannabis policy for Ridgefield on April 13th, 2022.
Or you know what, why don't we just have the motion be that the Ridgefield Board of Selectmen hereby establishes a policy not to allow any form of cannabis to be legally
Any form of cannabis business is what you're saying.
business to be established in the town of Ridgefield.
That's what they were trying to get to.
How about that? So we have a motion,
Sorry.
Barbara, seconded by Maureen. If there's no further comment, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Barbara?
Aye.
Nays? 1 nay. Motion carries.
On April 25th, First Selectman County sends the Planning and Zoning Commission a letter conveying the Board of Selectmen's decision and reasoning. The following evening of April 26th, he reminds the Commission that they asked for guidance and briefs the Commission on that guidance in person.
The Planning and Zoning Commission suggested that this is a policy decision that should be debated by the Board of Selectmen and decided there. If we were to say, yes, we want to move forward, we would send it back to P&Z to establish the regulation, location, and all the other variables that would go into that decision. If we said no on the policy, that would establish that decision. It turned out to be pretty interesting. We did hold 3 public hearings. First one, we had 4 people, the second 8, and the third about 22. It was interesting. The majority of people were against. There were some that felt it should go to a referendum. I consulted with counsel on that. Basically, it came down to 3 basic decisions we had to make. And I think Rob sent out the letter I sent that explained that we are not allowed to call a referendum on an opinion question. It would be 14 different areas. We had our discussion. The opinion of the Board of Selectmen was to vote to establish a policy. They would rather not even bother going to a referendum, that we establish a policy at that meeting, last meeting, which we voted. The motion was approved 4-1, 4 in favor of a no use policy. 1 person voted against the motion, which was the reason for he felt it should have gone to a referendum. And that's what is basically said in this letter here, explaining those 3 different alternatives that we had. And that's where we're at. But the Board of Selectmen voted not establish a regulation for marijuana in any of the uses. So it's quick overview, but I'm not going to go on and be repetitious relative to a policy, which is what the P&Z Commission
In
has.
your opinion, does that obviate the need for any kind of action on the part of the planning and zoning?
Well, I would say that's a discussion with the Planning and Zoning Commission. However, I would respectfully ask that you take the recommendation of the Board of Selectmen.
Commissioner Serena obliges by moving to draft regulations prohibiting all cannabis establishments and is seconded by Commissioner Constantino.
Squash it. I'll make a motion right now that the Planning and Zoning Commission regulate that no sale in any use, sale, fashion, or form of cannabis is allowed in town of Ridgefield.
So what I think what Rudy's asking us to do is to consider proposing, as Jerry said, proposing a zoning regulation that actually supports and puts teeth and force behind policy that the Board of Selectmen is doing.
So I forward my motion again. I forward my motion that we regulate that not allowed.
One option for sure to proceed is make a motion to draft the regulation. The regulation will have to be drafted. The motion is seconded. We were going to schedule public hearing.
We have a second on the motion.
We you want to state your motion clearly, just so that everybody
My
understands.
motion is that this board prohibit any sale, use, or distribution of cannabis in the town of Ridgefield to all extent we're allowed to govern by law.
Just want to help you with your motion. We can't, just so you know, we can't prohibit the sale and use, et cetera. What I think you want to do is
To be able to
prohibit
put
the
a distribution or any other
establishments.
establishment in the town of Ridgefield for cannabis.
That motion's been made. Seconded.
You need to say that we're going to draft.
That's what we'll need out of it.
Public hearing, we're gonna draft the regulation, we're gonna go through the procedure. That's my motion.
Motion is, just gonna make sure we do this correctly. The motion is made to request that staff work on drafting the regulation, which would prohibit cannabis, recreational cannabis establishments in Ridgefield pursuant to the policy. of the Board of Selectmen.
That's my motion.
That motion's been made and seconded.
But then joins his fellow commissioners in a unanimous vote to table his motion.
I think that the maker of that motion and the seconder would be wise to withdraw the motion and have it discussed by and with Tom Beecher so that we can all make a more educated and final decision as to how to dispense with it.
Well, Mr. Katz, you could make a motion to table the motion pending advice from Tom Beecher,
appreciate
and then we'd have to vote on your motion
I'll have
first.
The motion withdrawn.
My position is strong enough, I don't want to rescind the motion. I'd rather have a motion saying the table. If somebody's willing to make.
I'll
that
make a motion to table it until we talk to Tom Beecher and get the procedural legal.
So under Robert's Rules of Order, that motion takes precedence. You have to discuss and or vote on that motion first. That's the way Robert's Rules work. So the motion has been made to table this discussion and this vote until we can consult with Tom Beecher. That motion has been made and seconded. Any discussion? A further motion? Move to a vote on that.
I think that's okay, because, in the past, we've been challenged on so many things. We want to get it right the first time and not have to have other business even to challenges. So I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it right. Order, we'll still be here with them.
Okay. Any other further discussion on the tabling? Hearing none, I'll call that question. All in favor for tabling the motion until we have a consultation with Tom Beecher?
Aye, Elizabeth.
Hi, Chris Molyneux.
Oh, well, that was unanimous in the end. Thank you. Okay.
After the Planning and Zoning Commission punts again on the tabled motion on May the 10th, on May 18th, the First Selectman grows impatient and proposes an ordinance even after the Selectmen had already clearly expressed their will to pass a policy and pass it to Planning and Zoning for action without an ordinance.
Anything at all? Yes, Mr. Carr.
Kurt Carr, 62 Prospect Ridge. I was a little surprised to see your agenda tonight has an ordinance, a cannabis ordinance on it, given the fact that you voted 4-1 to have a town policy in opposition to cannabis.
Correct.
And pass that on to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So I'm not quite sure what's happened, since then. I know Planning and Zoning has had this on their agenda at least 2 times. And there were 2 commissioners who moved and seconded that they move ahead with zoning regulations that were in compliance with your request. That's currently has been tabled, and I think it's going to be coming up in the next meeting or 2. But I really don't know what happened since April 13th, why you would be going forward with this at this point in time. I think the decision you made on the 13th was sound, and it was clearly supported by everybody here except one person who spoke in opposition to it. So anyway, I just wanted to make those comments.
Sure. Briefly, I'll respond that you're correct. We did vote. It was 4-1. Mr. Conley was in favor of a referendum that we bring it to, and the rest of us felt the Board of Selectmen was a good vote. Bob, Maureen, and Barbara Manners. And when I went to the Planning and Zoning Commission and reported the results of that meeting, which is where the Board of Selectmen voted to establish a policy, I just want to say that our town council advised us that we can do that, but a policy of the Board of Selectmen does not preclude the Planning and Zoning Commission from passing its own regulation on whatever basis it wants to. However, an ordinance does. So I reported, when I was at Planning and Zoning, I was somewhat surprised myself to hear that it was being tabled, wanting to hear opinions from council. And I brought it back to the board, and I recommended that we begin the process of a ordinance, because the current moratorium expires in September of this year. And whether we wanted to move forward, my recommendation is that we should, based on statute that allows by local ordinance the town to prohibit marijuana or to opt out of the program established by the state of Connecticut. Hence, we've begun working on an ordinance, and that's why we're doing it, just to be sure. Belt and suspenders, if you will. Thank you. Now, we'll get to a couple of interns we have, and David is here to talk about the cannabis ordinance, which Mr. Carr was asking about earlier before we started. But girls, why don't you come down and introduce yourself. David, come on down. Both Jax and Lauren, introduce yourselves to the board, tell them a little bit about yourselves. Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. I'm Jax Mantione. I'm an intern with Mr. Marconi. I'm a senior at Ridgefield High School, and I'm going to Northwestern next year for economics.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm also interning in Mr. Marconi's office for the recent internship program at IHS. I'm going to New Haven next year from Yale University, majoring in ethics, politics, and economics.
Oh, we have two pretty bright young ladies.
Obviously.
And David, you wish you were going to college next year. But David, I had asked to take a look at the ordinance that was sent up, as well as you had an associate print one up. And then Jax was focused on the cannabis regulation. So why don't you tell us, we did send, and David followed up with, and I'll give you this, everybody?
This is waiting for us.
Okay, I put it on the table.
Thank you.
That was written by Cohen and Wolf.
Right,
so I have-
Someone probably a little more experienced than me.
But it was a good exercise.
And let me say that, there was no qualitative criticism on the basis of what was done. Pat Sullivan in our office does a lot of this work, and Jack Casino, who's the associate who did most of the drafting on it, had some experience with it, felt that the definitions could be maybe more comprehensive. The intention was, of course, and I think you all know, this is not a limitation on the use of cannabis. That's by Connecticut statute now legal in certain limitations, with certain limitations. The intention here was that the towns were given the right to determine whether they wanted to allow the distribution, retail, or cultivation of cannabis in the towns. And this is essentially an ordinance which would be adopted by the Board of Selectmen. Our thinking being that the Board of Selectmen is a more comprehensive body than the Planning and Zoning Commission.
But adopted by a town meeting.
Oh, yes, it's an ordinance. Well, I mean, yes, this would be an ordinance, not a Planning and Zoning
Not a
regulation.
policy, which is what we had done, and I was explaining earlier on, before we actually got started, that the Board of Selectmen had voted on a policy, 4-1, with Sean feeling that it should have gone to a referendum. And I attended the Planning and Zoning Commission to pass on. There was a motion and a second to go ahead and create regulation prohibiting, but then people felt, and I think it was 1 abstention, 5-3-1, that they wanted to hear from council. And I felt, well, they asked us to establish a policy, we did, and now they were hesitating, so I felt, well, maybe we should just move forward with an ordinance to be sure, because their moratorium expires in September. They don't meet in August, and here we are in the middle of May, time is running out, and I wanted to be sure that we addressed it prior to the expiration of the moratorium.
Yeah, and this was just a judgment call on our part, but we felt that this was a more appropriate body to deal with it. I mean, though the Planning and Zoning Commission is brought into it.
Right.
Definitions, but that was. our
Most of
thinking.
the towns that passed regulations were passed in the planning and zoning, the zoning commissions. A lot of
I
them.
went to the planning and zoning meeting that they had the night of the budget, because they had cannabis discussion on that agenda. And they did get, I mean, the meeting lasted a very long time because they were talking about 34 Bailey Avenue for almost 2 hours, 2.5 hours, right? And then when they got to the cannabis part of it, they tabled it to another, so they didn't talk about that. And then the next discussion item was going to be affordable housing, which I thought would be another hot topic for me to
Right.
listen to, and they tabled that as well. So I was like, shoot, I just sat here for 3
Wait,
hours
all
and
that
I didn't get to learn anything.
So, David, thank you for the work you did and reviewing this, but Jax, why don't you talk a little bit about the work you did as well, what you
Yeah.
found out?
Well, I didn't really
And if
know
you're
what
in
I was
concert
doing,
with-
but I did my best. And I basically wrote up, based on the like 14 different types that you spoke to me about the licensing. I wrote an ordinance kind of prohibiting any of those licensing, any of those licenses within Ridgefield, and referencing the statutes about like, you know, personal use and cultivation, which obviously will still be allowed because that's a state statute. But the retail, sale, distribution, and like cultivation being prohibited in Ridgefield. I mean, obviously, I think all of it's pretty in-depthly covered in this version. I definitely did struggle with the definitions. I wasn't entirely sure what I was supposed to do for that,
As you
but
can see, this is a review of a many number of ordinances in the
Yeah.
past, and we think, you know, that you did a wonderful job. It's just,
Yeah.
this, we thought it was a little more comprehensive.
Yeah.
But, you know, in terms of, the use, the only thing I would point out here is that we did prohibit, and this is all sales now, we're not prohibiting the activity, but the palliative uses were, in terms of sale, were still prohibited. Now, you can do whatever way you want on that, but we just wrote a fairly comprehensive ordinance which basically prohibited the sale, cultivation of
And I think
cannabis.
that was the,
Yeah.
And that was, I
Prior,
thought that
yeah,
was the
order.
general-
But I
Can I-
have one other question in addition to that. I mean, so, yeah, this ordinance speaks specifically to the cultivation and retail sales. But what about use? I mean,
No,
why don't, I mean, they can smoke, people can smoke pot where they're walking down Main Street?
Well, they
21
can,
years
they
of age
can
or older.
have in for their possession unlimited ounces. And I think in the home, you're allowed to keep 12 ounces,
Right.
but.
but you're allowed so many plants.
yeah, 3 mature,
And the
3
cultivation, when
mature
you're talking about
per
cultivation,
person.
yeah, that.
But there are
that's-
areas in town that we prohibit the
Only
smoking,
the
or
place you
cigarettes,
The only
right?
place you- well,
No,
No, I mean,
that's
we
not
don't
what
allow
this is
people-
doing.
No, I know that, but should, I mean, can we do
For
that, or should
example,
we
in
do
public
that?
areas, you're not allowed to smoke within 25, 50 feet, whatever it is,
So
of
we
a
prohibit
public
it. We just
building.
felt
we
that-
prohibited it at the concerts at Dollar
Or-
Smoking is smoking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But
so
the-
that
the
would be covered
question
by,
is
the
how-
same as cigarettes, correct?
Yes.
The question is, it becomes significantly more difficult to police this, I believe. And I'm not sure whether you want to talk to the police department about their operation and enforcement of it. If we're talking about use, if we're talking about sale, that's easy. I mean, not easy, but.
Easier, yeah.
But you can say if somebody's has to come in and get a license and they can't do it because it's not permitted in this town.
But if they're not allowed to smoke in an area, a cigarette,
As long as
then,
e-cigs are covered under that,
then this should be
They should
covered
be
as
covered
well,
as well,
right?
yeah.
You
Say
can't,
that
if you,
again.
e-cigarettes, as long as like vape pens and e-cigarettes are covered under the inability to smoke in certain areas, then weed use,
It
like
would apply
smoking,
here
would
as
apply
well.
here. The only thing that you can't control is use of edibles. So if someone is
Yeah.
taking edibles in public area, that you can't.
What about on like
Control.
a town property? Yeah, here.
Edibles you
Very
can't, I mean,
limited.
there's no way to really, unless like, I mean, if you're going into work, then an employee, it falls on the employer to, you know, be able to
Right.
see that or test that, which also is difficult because there aren't really like tests where you can see if at that specific time someone is under the influence of weed. It's only like, it lasts 3 days in your system, drug tests for weed, so it's hard to
Pinpoint when it happens.
when it
Right.
happens or if they're high at
Well,
work.
we operate under federal law, the municipality does,
Mhm.
and under federal law, it's illegal.
Yes.
If we test someone who tests positive,
But
are those grounds for dismissal based on federal law, or will be thrown out by state courts?
I don't believe it would be able to like, cause to police for like dismissal if it tests positive, cause it is 3 days, and if the state statute is allowing personal use for adults 21 and older, and there isn't a test that can show you if they're high at a
Are there
specific time.
exclusions on who can use, for example, police, fire,
Can't be, no,
highway
but you
drivers
can't
with
be under
CDLs
21.
driving huge trucks with
I-
tons of
I don't-
There's an
material?
age restriction section.
Yeah.
Age,
It's
the only
so the
matter
age
where
of
it's-
the-
Just the age
But
restriction.
we
yes.
can't say, so what you're saying is we
Fire-
can't say like,
Fire engine?
you know, no one in our fire, police, whatever.
Yeah, I think
City
employers
temperature.
have the ability, obviously, to make like like an independent business could say, like, we don't want our employees using
Yes.
any cannabis products, but you wouldn't be able to like truly prohibit the use, especially in like public kind of employment situations like the police or the fire department. I don't think you'd really have much ability to police that. And that was a lot of what that webinar was about.
What about pilots?
I really don't think there's any way to,
I mean, military pilots and commercial airline pilots. and I-
yeah, yeah.
We
Well, there
can't
may be
force
something
it.
that indicates that, well,
Could be.
sobriety are
Yeah.
prohibited, especially with pilots.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think pilots
I would
and
think,
police with
yes,
guns.
I would have to say that there would be
Yeah.
some limitations. Obviously, the FAA would probably have a ruling on that, they would have jurisdiction
I'm sure there's gonna be some court cases coming up as well.
over it. Right.
And there are also probably like coordination tests and stuff that people are doing for people in those jobs.
Talk about the webinar you attended.
Yeah, there are probably like employers are doing certain tests to see to the best of their ability if someone's high at their time of work, but there isn't any test currently available that can tell you whether or not someone's high like at that time.
Are they trying to craft tests?
I'm sure they are.
I mean, they
but-
have to
Well,
be.
blood
right?
test will show the presence of,
Yeah, but it could be 3
but,
days.
I mean,
That's
Well-
all, that's,
if they used on a Sunday and they were tested Tuesday morning,
yeah, which is the difficult
So,
part because the
our
company
policy
can't
is
say.
no drug use, especially in police, fire,
Mhm.
highway where you're,
no drug use, period,
Yeah.
not just when you're on recording.
no, if you test positive, you get time off
Okay,
first offense.
okay.
I think that's why, like webinars like that are trying to train employers to kind of recognize with their own, like knowledge of drug use, to kind of make a decision about whether, they're under the influence of drugs or not, since sometimes those tests.
Like a doctor's note saying it's
No, it sounds like a
okay.
judgment call.
Yeah, it is.
No, to evaluate, so you're saying that a doctor's not saying it's okay, I think you're saying to evaluate,
Oh,
be able to look at
okay.
and see someone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know
They're
Jeff at
higher.
some point, our police chief was in and saying, you know, there's things that you can kind of sort of see, but it's very nebulous, right? You can't, you know, quite
Yeah.
be sure.
So we try to stay away from that, we basically provide regulation as is provided for the statute to the town, not to allow the sale or distribution. You could go further, but we start getting lots of sort of nebulous areas and, I think that was the theory behind it. I mean, we could look at that again, but it seems to be what we are.
If we decide to go forward and do the ordinance, can the planning and zoning do anything that would,
Well, they were given some authority under this. That's a little unclear, I have to admit that, as to what they would do, but it would seem to me that the municipality would be primarily involved, I mean, as the whole municipality, not just the planning and zoning commission.
right?
I'm not sure what you had in mind. but
No,
we
that
can
was
look at
kind of
it.
my question, like, is there something that the planning, a policy that they could pass that would be,
Supersede this?
well, not, or undermine it?
Or, yeah.
Now this becomes a law of the town.
And then it's
Yeah.
done, then they,
That's it.
okay,
I would say that the town ordinance would.
Yeah,
Would
would trump
supersede,
a
yeah.
regulation and zoning.
okay, okay.
And I think that's what zoning was asking for, our opinion.
Yeah.
Sure, they absolutely did, yeah.
The discussion at that meeting was that this is, the Planning and Zoning Commission is not a policymaking board of the town. That is the Board of Selectmen's responsibility, and recognizing that, they sent it here for that policy to be established.
And then
An
they write the
election,
regulations.
don't forget,
Oh,
the
right,
election
right,
took
that's
place,
right.
there are a lot of different people,
Right.
and the moratorium, so I'm not gonna be repetitious, but if we wanna be sure we move forward with the policy, the strongest way to do it is through an ordinance.
Yes, that was our opinion.
So we should read through both of them and
Yeah.
see what.
Make sure
Yeah, and if you have
everything's covered.
questions,
Yeah.
we can certainly address this again. I assume that you want to look at this more thoroughly.
Yeah,
Yeah, because we just.
Yeah, they
This
just-
this one,
Yeah.
so this I did see, so just, maybe this is something, I was, this is the one that you wrote here,
Yes.
right? And maybe you kind of took this directly from the definitions when you talked through the 14 different
Yeah.
things. So it says, we're not gonna give a license for a cultivator,
Yeah.
and it says where, medical and adult use where 15,000 square feet of gross space
Mhm.
is required.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily say what happens if it's 1,000 or, for it's below that.
Yeah,
I-
well, the micro cultivator, 2,000 to 10,000 square feet of grow space is required. So the cultivator is mainly describing like really large, like if there were to be a company that was trying to create like a large
Sure, sure,
dispensary
okay.
in Ridgefield, like that would be the licensing that they would need, whereas like someone trying to create a smaller dispensary or like cultivate a
the
smaller
micro.
amount would be the micro
But
cultivator.
under this, you wouldn't be able to do that.
No,
But then there's a gap between, 10,001
Yeah.
to 15,000,
well,
that's just not
once
addressed.
it gets to 10,000, there's like regulations that you have to be able to expand by another 5,000 square feet
Okay.
to expand it all. So you can either be operating between 2,000 and 10,000 square feet or 15,000 plus. And then once you get to 15,000, you have to be jumping by 5,000 square feet each time. I don't know why that's a thing, but it is.
I knew we were gonna ask you that.
It was probably somebody's compromise.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess to me, it's like, but even something, like, we're not gonna issue a permit for someone with 1,000
Yeah.
square feet, like, we're not gonna issue
Not gonna
any
do it.
permit
Yeah.
for any
Well,
cultivation, is that a fair
correct.
statement?
Yes,
Because
yeah.
so you look at this and it's like,
And it does, yeah.
it's a little confusing, but,
This prohibits it.
Well, these are
Yeah.
all the licensing that would be available in a different, there is no licensing really needed for less than 2,000 square feet, because that would kind of fall under the more personal, like, 'cause
Yeah, okay.
you wouldn't be able to get a license to be any type of cultivator if you had less than 2,000 square
Got it,
feet
got it.
in the
Alright.
first place, so.
so it requires lots of knowledge of understanding. what it is.
Yeah, right.
And I'm looking at this and I'm like, well,
Yeah.
And you can cultivate, which means you can have like 4 plants.
yeah, sure.
I mean, but that's.
But you're not getting a permit for that.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
No, no.
But, and I think you confirmed this, like, my statement that we would not be issuing any permits for any
Yes.
cultivation,
We're not.
that's a
Yeah.
wrong statement, that is true,
Blanket
okay.
statement, yes.
But I would still have to, if I want to put a greenhouse on my property for Jan to grow vegetables, I need a permit for that.
You would in zoning,
Yeah.
it's a structure.
So then I
But if
could
you-
grow.
But there are
But if-
people
but
that
if you
have
wanted-
those windows,
Yes.
and some have a solarium that they could do a lot of growing in, and they would be allowed to grow, but it would be limited by.
Yeah, it's 3
Four,
mature
12
plants,
12 plants in
3
total.
immature plants
Right.
per like
Right.
individual, and then it's 12, there's a cap on
Total
12
12,
plants
right.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
in a household.
I don't know how much you grow on 4 plants.
But also there would have to be like X number of individuals to get to that 12 plant
Right.
cap anyways.
For-
Yeah.
Well,
X number
when
of
you-
adults in the household?
Oh, adults
in
in
the
the
household.
household.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. They spent a lot of time writing this law.
But also at the same time to try and prohibit the, what are they, gummies?
Edibles.
Edibles.
But you're getting the spam from your, on your
Edibles.
email all the time.
No, I mean, it is an issue though, because there are cases of adults having like edibles in their house and kids think that they're
Kids,
gummies.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and dogs as well there have been cases of dogs.
And it can kill a dog.
Wow.
Yeah.
Small amount can kill a dog.
Really?
Yep, saw it on Dr. Pole.
Oh, there you
A lot
go.
of dogs have been seen to have eaten the edibles
Yeah.
and just been high
Guy
and been
had his
fine,
dog was
but.
failing, just going downhill. And they said the dog ate something out of an ashtray.
Mhm.
And there was
Yeah, it
a
was a
little
full
bit.
joint though. It was like, it wasn't an edible. I think
No,
dogs that are
yeah,
seen
right,
to
right,
have
right.
consumed edibles have, for the most part, been fine, but the
Right.
joint,
Right.
that's a bigger issue.
It's very chill.
Yeah, they've just been very chill.
But it's something that people need to be aware of.
Yeah,
Oh, for sure,
absolutely.
yeah. I mean, it was
Yeah,
like the
this is
whole
interesting.
issue with like even Tide Pods in the past, like that was a big thing. So there are like, there are child locks on like other medicine products, so.
So thank you for your work.
This is great. How much longer are you interning?
Until
graduation?
June 10th, I think. is
June
the
10th.
date.
Nice, exciting. That's great.
We're thinking of making a trip to Hartford. We're not sure if they're having tours there at all, I usually go through the the lieutenant governor's office.
Nice.
Whoever it's been has always been very accommodating, welcomes us into the office, we go over to the Senate, to look at
That's
the
nice.
House chambers, et cetera, so it's an interesting trip to try and make that for the interns. And give them experience about how government works,
Yeah, perfect.
and an ordinance was a perfect example,
Yes.
right? So thank you, and I
Of
know
course.
you gotta get home, you haven't been home yet, so.
Yeah. Yes, one day. They all are.
Oh, you don't have any homework.
No, I do not. I do not have any homework.
Okay, since you don't have any, your homework tonight will.
Yeah.
Don't you still have AP tests to take? and
No,
things
AP
like that?
tests are the
Oh, they're all
first 2
done?
weeks of
Yeah,
May.
Oh,
seniors.
wow.
Mhm.
Boy, you're on
Get your
vacation.
assessments, yeah.
Yeah,
They're working hard, you, what do you think?
No, you're right, that's true.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, guys.
It's great
Good luck.
meeting you.
David, you wanna hang around for
We will.
the executive
Yeah,
session,
sure.
right? But we will move on unless there are any other questions about cannabis.
In the end, they do not vote one way or the other, leaving this in limbo. The multi-page phantom ordinance is thus presumably put on hold for a future Board of Selectmen meeting. On May 24th, this becomes a premise for the Planning and Zoning Commission to sidestep any action again, and Mr. Serena and Ms. Constantino are coerced into withdrawing their tabled motion from April 26th.
All right, item 3.5, this is the recreational cannabis discussion. Ooh, this is the time of night for this discussion. So we put a couple of questions to Tom Beecher. The three questions were essentially, number one, what is the impact of the Board of Selectmen policy? Is there a legal impact of that?
So real quick, can you remind us what maybe you're going to, but
Yeah.
I'd like to be reminded what were the three options they had and then what did they decide?
The three options they had, they weren't really framed up, honestly, in the way that I would frame it. I'm going to answer that
Yeah,
question
okay, sure.
in a different way.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just about to answer
Okay.
that question. So the Board of Selectmen made a policy. The policy is not, it doesn't have the enforceability under the statute. The statute, the way the law was written, cannabis establishments, and we're talking now, I'm not talking about smoking or growing or anything else. I'm talking about the physical establishments. There's 14 different types of by the way, there's actually like 11, but there's a couple of hybrid, like mixed units. So some people say 11, some people say 14. But there's these.
Is it just the retail we're talking about?
No, that's what I'm trying to be
Okay,
clear
okay,
about.
okay, okay.
There are 14 different types of cannabis establishments, capital C, capital E, this is a legal term. These types of cannabis establishments run the gamut, everything from retail to product packaging to transportation, warehousing, growing, farming, yes, lots of different, and there's different types of growers, by the way, small grower, large grower, etc. 14 different types. We don't have time tonight to go through all 14. So all of these are legal, will be legal across all of Connecticut, and will be licensed through a state program and a lottery and everything else, unless one of two things. Every town has the ability to either regulate or ban cannabis establishments through either one, a zoning regulation, or two, an ordinance. An ordinance has to be proposed by the Board of Selectmen and then voted on by, a special town meeting. In theory, all members, all residents of the town, but it's really who shows up at the special meeting. That's the way that works, right? So those are the only two ways legally that a town can ban cannabis establishments.
And the Board of Selectmen chose not to go after the ordinance.
Well, I'm going to get to that part.
Okay. I'm getting ahead.
And sorry, Rob, back to what my original question was that there's no picking apart these establishments. We're not talking about just one, we're talking about all of them on one umbrella, and there's no talk of separating them out at this point.
There is the possibility,
Okay.
under for us, for example, planning and zoning, to create a zoning regulation that allows certain types of establishments and not others. We could also make a zoning regulation that requires that these types of establishments go to certain zones. We could create an overlay zone. We could prohibit them from the CBD, et cetera. We could regulate hours. We can regulate signage. We can't regulate everything, but in the statute, there's a number of things that we can do to regulate them. Regulate as in control, how they physically manifest themselves in our community. That's what a zoning regulation normally does, is kind of control where things go and how they operate. So back to the three questions, just to make sure we kind of get those answers out. So the Board of Selectmen policy, while it was a nice signal, doesn't actually legally stop these licenses from being issued by the state. The only way you can stop the licenses from being issued or control them in any way is through a zoning regulation or an ordinance, which the Board of Selectmen will have to pass. So that was a question that we had, just I think in the last conversation, it was like, what is the policy, what does it do?
Yeah.
The second thing we asked is, and it was actually thanks to Mr. Carr, who I still see sitting here, he spotted, thank you very much, section 7.13.b.2 under our old regulations. Even before we had the moratorium, which we passed last year, there was a really fine subpoint that actually banned the dispensing and growing of marijuana. And those words are kind of important, dispensing and growing of marijuana in Ridgefield. So we asked Mr. Beecher, well, if that was there, why do we even need to have a moratorium? Because that seems to sort of do the ban. Well, the answer is, it's unclear that that regulation would be effective. I'm not saying it definitely wouldn't be. It's just not entirely clear under the new regulation, because there are certain under the new state law, there are certain types of businesses, for example, transportation. There's a type of business that can literally just be distributing cannabis throughout the entire state, maybe not even in Ridgefield, and they just happen to have their little hub, like their Amazon hub in Ridgefield. That's a potential business under the new regime, in the new world. Well, that business may not be dispensing or growing in Ridgefield. Right? So that type of business may actually fall into a crack. So that, while that section 7.13.b.2 that Mr. Carr spotted for us, it's helpful, it's interesting, but it's actually probably needs to be updated under the current regulation. Also, that regulation was written with the word marijuana, and actually the new thing is cannabis. Cannabis is actually a larger universe than marijuana. So those are just kind of cleanups that we would need to do. That section is not actually sufficient to do what we need to do. And the third thing that we asked, and it was mainly, frankly, because Mr. Katz, in our discussion during the one meeting, signaled his inclination to abstain, if I can put it that way. Because he did make that inclination on the record, and because I heard several people that seemed very inclined and several people that maybe were less inclined to support a full ban, I actually took upon myself to ask Mr. Beecher for my own education, what happens if we have one member abstaining and we have a 4-4 split amongst the commission?
because that's certainly a possibility when you have a few people on each side, you only have a few people that seem. So in the event of a tie, it's important for you to know that the motion fails. So if, for example, the motion was to enact a regulation for a full ban, and it was ended up as a 4-4 tie because we had one abstention, that motion would fail, just for your knowledge.
Unless I misunderstood, I thought the abstention or John's suggestion, and why I recalled the motion, was we wanted to find out from legal counsel that if we do enact a zoning regulation, the issue never comes back. We don't, it's done.
Yes, and the answer is yes to that.
Okay.
Okay, so now, let me just finish sharing with you and then we can discuss. So those are the answers in the sense of it. In the subsequent time of what's it been, I guess 3 weeks or 4 weeks since we first had this discussion, the Board of Selectmen have already decided that they will move forward with a ordinance, which frankly, I'll say, I think is the right thing in terms of sequence. They've had a bunch of public hearings already. They've voted already with a very clear, opinion, view on what they see as the outcome. So they intend to move forward with an ordinance. I personally think that the right thing is that if for some reason that ordinance doesn't carry, then it falls upon us, in my view, to discuss a regulation. It's my recommendation to you, but we're going to have discussion.
And just to clarify, there's nothing stopping us from coming up with some regulation, even something conflicting with the ordinance, which the ordinance would take precedence, right, if that passed. But if it didn't pass or whatever, there's nothing stopping us from proceeding however we want in the meantime.
We could proceed. I would say the reason why I would not recommend that is because in order for us to proceed, we have to have public hearings. So I just think about kind of the experience of the community, frankly, that if we propose anything in the way of a regulation, then the whole community needs to come out, be active, and testify and get excited about what we're doing at the same time that the Board of Selectmen would be working on an ordinance. And frankly, I think that's confusing and unhealthy for the community.
Vote anyhow, right?
What's that?
The ordinance has to go to a public vote anyway.
That's right.
Would those things be simultaneous or one following the other? Like, would the ordinance happen first and then we would decide? Because that would be, they wouldn't be simultaneous.
They're not, no, my recommendation is to allow the ordinance
Right.
process to go through. If for some reason the ordinance fails, then we need to act before the moratorium ends.
So do we need to vote on anything today, or just?
We have a motion on the table, which was tabled only until we got this response. So I've delivered the response that you needed, the information. So either the motion needs to be acted upon or the motion can be withdrawn.
What was the motion again? How was it worded?
Because the town is going to go ahead with an ordinance, which I believe will pass. Well, that's just a belief. I'm more than willing to withdraw the motion because it's sort of unnecessary.
Yeah, I made the motion, I would withdraw it, based on those facts.
We can always circle back around, right?
Yes, and in fact, we more or less would have to act because our current regulation, as I mentioned, our current regulation is a bit ambiguous. We have a moratorium that goes to the end of September, which is nice and tight and clear. But if that moratorium expires, then the current regulation, which Mr. Carr, spotted for us, is ambiguous. It may be fine, it may not be, but it's not written with current law in mind.
Is the ordinance going to capture the entire businesses that we just became aware of?
I haven't seen the ordinance,
If
but
it's a prohibitive ordinance, it'll cover all.
It'll capture everything. So there won't be a loophole, because that was originally why we.
yeah. I haven't seen the draft, although actually I believe a draft was shared at the Board of Selectmen meeting last week, so it's out there.
Yeah, I don't think they voted on it. I think
They didn't vote on it, but
it's been tabled, so they haven't, made it sound like they decided to go forward with it.
yeah.
They probably will, but they haven't decided that yet.
And Rob, another thing you want to keep in mind is you could always extend the moratorium.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's what we would, let's just play it out by time. If, it's May 24th now, if the Board of Selectmen, they're already drafting, assuming that sometime in June they finish their draft and they call their meeting. I can't speak for Board of Selectmen, but I imagine maybe that meeting would probably be in July sometime. If for some reason if the ordinance is passed, then it's fine, the issue's closed. If the ordinance fails, then we would need to act, and we have two kind of pathways ourselves. One is we could extend our moratorium, or two is we could actually just quickly begin to actually write a regulation that was a permanent regulation that addressed whether it's a full ban or a partial ban, establishments. It becomes, it's a complicated conversation, but you
We
know,
can wait.
we would need to do that if the ordinance doesn't carry.
If my fellow members think that's the way to go, I agree 100%. I'll rescind the motion.
Do any more voting or?
The motion's
No,
done.
you rescind it.
Send it,
Motion's
we're
been
good?
withdrawn.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Great.
I think the Board of Selectmen thought we weren't moving. That was, I was watching the meeting on the TV, and they were, I think they were confused, because we didn't get to it last time, and that's one of them said it afterwards, it was because we ran out of time.
Yep.
Because we spent, that we moved it to now, but they were getting a little worried,
Yep.
so that's why they decided to move forward.
Okay. Next item, 3.6.
So this becomes an excuse for inaction. And yet, when the Board of Selectmen convene on June 1st, the Phantom Cannabis Ordinance is not on the agenda. It is not mentioned or discussed. We are dangerously and speedily approaching the end of the road when the current moratorium expires on September 24th, and unless extended, face a definite deadline. This multi-page Phantom Ordinance is much more complicated than it needs to be. In contrast, there is a much simpler solution. Ridgefield's zoning regulations could be more easily revised by simply updating definitions in Section 2.2, merely referencing the definitions as codified in the State Statute Section 1 of Public Act 21-1. Delete the outdated language in Section 7.13 and replace it with language corresponding with the state statute. A motion to initiate this process would obviate the need for an ordinance. It would only require a public hearing and an affirmative vote of 5 of the 9 commissioners. But even that takes time that is rapidly running out. Ridgefield can extinguish this political hot potato and eliminate the looming cannabis threat to our community. If not by P&Z commissioner, then by an application from any citizen or group of citizens for the zoning change. The commission would be required to accept the application, hold a public hearing, and then approve with 5 affirmative votes by commissioners within 65 days. So there is no more time to squander. This video written, narrated, and produced by Kirk Carr. Thank you for watching. Copyright 2022, all rights reserved.